On the night of the 5th of February 1945, an American army truck sat parked on a quiet street in the French town of Colmar, and there was not a single guard on it. There should have been. Locked in the strong boxes, bolted to its bed, was one of the most closely held secrets of the entire war, and the German front line was 4 miles up the road. Inside those safes was a cipher machine, and the machine, in a sense, was the least of it. Packed in with it were the keys and the rotors that made it run, and the machine was the reason a great deal of the war could be carried out in the open, over the radio, in front of anyone who cared to listen, without the enemy understanding a word. Every Allied plan for the coming spring assault into Germany had been enciphered on a machine exactly like this one. So had the arrangements for President Roosevelt's journey to meet Stalin at Yalta. If the wrong people opened those boxes and grasped what they were holding, they would be able to read the most secret orders of the Western Allies, at the precise moment those armies were massing for the final drive across the Rhine. The men who had brought the truck into Colmar had done nearly everything wrong that a tired signal company does wrong at the end of a hard campaign. The town had been in German hands 72 hours before. The fighting was not even finished. Off to the north, the last of the German pocket was still being ground down, close enough that you could hear it in the street. The unit's motor pool had not yet come forward, so there was no secure yard to put the truck in, and it was left at the curb for the night, without guards, as the rules plainly required. A radio truck from the same company was parked directly across the road. Its crew was up and down all night, climbing out into the cold to run the engine so it would not freeze. In the morning, asked what they had seen, every one of them swore he had neither seen nor heard a thing, because in the morning the truck was gone. 2 officers walked out to it after breakfast to make a small repair and found an empty length of curb. Within hours, the alarm had gone across the whole theatre, and the question that went with it was the kind that ends careers and, in a bad week, loses battles. Was this thieves, or was this the enemy? It was not a foolish thing to fear. Men from this same signal company had been captured by the Germans in the days just before the truck vanished. If any one of them had talked, the enemy already knew that a unit carrying exactly this kind of material was sitting in Colmar. A 4-mile drive in the dark, a truck that answered to no guard, and the most secure communication system the United States possessed could be in a German workshop by dawn. The reaction went straight to the top. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, involved himself in it personally, ordered a search at the highest priority, and pulled every Allied high command into the hunt. From Washington, the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, cabled Eisenhower directly. A truck had been stolen at Colmar, the cable said, carrying 30 important pieces of code and cipher equipment. It would take several months just to replace the rotors. And then one line that tells you how far this had already gone. This is a vital loss to our signal security. For 32 days, no one on the Allied side knew which answer was the true one. Then the truck turned up, abandoned in the countryside behind the lines, its bumpers stripped off and its unit numbers painted over. The trailer was there. The tractor and the safes were not. It took most of another 2 weeks, a French intelligence unit, and a river partly turned out of its course to find them. The heavy safe, the one with the machine in it, had been sunk in a riverbed. When they raised it at last and brought it up to Paris and cut it open, in front of what one account calls half the intelligence staffs in the city, they found the machine still inside and packed in around it. 2 55-pound charges of thermite and blocks of TNT, all wired to their detonators. The men cutting the safe apart had run their torch out of oxygen a moment before the flame reached the charge. And that is the first strange thing about this machine, though it is not the strangest. The enemy may have held it for a month. It made no difference. Nothing came of it. Nothing ever came of it, because in the whole of the war, in Europe and in the Pacific, listening to it every single day, neither Germany nor Japan ever read one word this machine had written. It was the most secret and the most secure cipher machine of the Second World War. Almost no one alive has heard its name. The Americans called it the SIGABA. If you had been allowed to see one, which almost no one was, it would have looked like a cousin of the German Enigma. There were the same banks of rotors, the little wheels wound with wire that did the actual scrambling, spinning behind a lid. Both machines worked on the same broad idea. You typed a letter, current ran through a maze of wired rotors, the rotors turned, and a different letter came out the other side. A new one each time so that the same plain letter never enciphered the same way twice in a row. That much they shared. Everything that mattered was different, and the difference is the whole story. The standard Enigma had 3 rotors that stepped in a fixed and knowable pattern. Every time a key was struck, the first rotor advanced one position, and when it came full circle, it nudged the next one along, exactly the way the numbers roll over on a car's odometer. It was regular, it was predictable. And that predictability is what gave the codebreakers at Bletchley Park their way in. Once you know the rhythm a machine keeps, you have a thread to pull, and the Allies pulled it until the whole thing came apart in their hands. The American machine had 15 rotors in 3 banks of 5, and its designers had done something with them that no one had done before. They used one set of rotors to drive the others. On the Enigma, the rotors marched like a clock. On the SIGABA, a second bank of wheels decided, from one keystroke to the next, how the first bank would move, so that anywhere from 1 to 4 of the Cipher rotors might jump at once, or none of them in the place you expected. The stepping was not a rhythm at all. It was closer to a maze that rebuilt itself every time you touched a key. There was no odometer to read because the machine was, in effect, shuffling its own gears in a pattern nothing outside it could follow. The numbers are hard to hold in your head. A single arrangement of the 5 scrambling wheels could throw a letter into nearly 12 million different alphabets, where the same count on the Enigma came to something closer to 17,000. And that was before you counted the ways the 10 large wheels could be ordered and turned and dropped into the machine upside down, which ran to millions of arrangements more. On the most protected circuit of the entire war, the one that carried the private cables between Roosevelt and Churchill, the settings were kept so far apart that the number of possibilities a codebreaker would have had to grind through climbed past anything the arithmetic of that age could reach. It was not a harder version of the same problem the Allies had solved with the Enigma. It was a different order of problem, and it did not have a bottom. The man most responsible for that idea had seen the flaw in every other rotor machine years before anyone broke one. In 1934, writing to the Patent Office about an earlier and weaker design, William Friedman had put his finger on the exact weakness that would one day sink the Enigma. The regular recurring movement of the rotors, he wrote, introduces a predictable factor, and that predictable factor defeats the essential purpose of the whole machine. He named the disease years before the Allies proved on the Germans how fatal it was. And then he and the people around him built the one wartime machine that did not have it. So here was the situation that ran underneath the entire war, and that almost no one knew about. The Germans and the Japanese heard American cipher traffic constantly. They recorded it, they filed it, they set their best people on it. They could tell it apart from everything else on the air. They simply could not read it. Not once. Not at the beginning, when they were winning, and not at the end, when they had every reason in the world to try harder. Now hold that next to the machine you have actually heard of. You know about the Enigma. You have seen the film, or you know the name Bletchley Park, or you know that a brilliant and troubled man named Alan Turing helped break it and was rewarded with ruin. There is a reason the Enigma is famous, and it is not that it was the best machine. It is that it failed. It was broken, and out of the breaking came a story, a magnificent one, full of secret rooms and near misses and a race against the clock that helped decide the war. The American machine is unknown for the exact opposite reason. It worked. It did precisely the job it was built to do, in silence, for years, and nothing happened. No disaster, no betrayal, no dramatic rescue, because none was ever needed. And a thing that works perfectly and quietly leaves no story behind it at all. That is the paradox this whole account is built on. Success in this trade is invisible. It looks exactly like nothing happening. A machine that cannot be read has to be invented by somebody. And the people who invented this one worked in a couple of rooms in Washington, in a unit so small you could have fit all of them around a single long table. In the early 1930s, the United States had almost no code-breaking establishment to speak of. What it had was a tiny outfit inside the Army called the Signal Intelligence Service, run by William Friedman, a former geneticist who had wandered into the field almost by accident and turned out to be one of the finest cryptologic minds the country would ever produce. Friedman had gone looking for young mathematicians and language men and hired the first of them himself, 3 former high school teachers who had scored at the top of a civil service exam. One of those 3 was a man from the mountains of Virginia named Frank Rowlett. Rowlett is the man at the center of this, and for a long time he was stuck on the most thankless job in the office. Friedman had a design for a better cipher machine, one that took its scrambling instructions from a long strip of paper tape punched with holes, an idea borrowed from the telegraph. The trouble was the tape. It was fragile, it was slow to make, it tore, it jammed, and producing the stuff was, in Rowlett's own words later, close to the most hopeless task he had ever been handed. He spent his days making brittle paper ribbons for a machine that deserved better, and somewhere in that frustration, in May of 1934, he had the thought that changed American cryptography. What if you threw the paper tape away and let a second set of rotors do its work instead? What if the thing that decided how the cipher rotors moved was not a strip of punched paper at all, but more rotors? Wired wheels controlling wired wheels, throwing out the same jumble of impulses the holes and gaps in the tape had produced, only with no tape left to tear. He said as much to Friedman. He thought, he told him, that it would be a hell of a good idea to replace those key tapes with a second set of rotors. Friedman told him no. He did more than tell him no. By Rowlett's account, Friedman flatly refused to believe the thing was even possible, and he held that position for the better part of a year. The two of them went round and round about it. Rowlett was convinced he was right and could not move his own boss, and at one point he was angry and worried enough to talk about resigning, or going over Friedman's head to the chief signal officer himself, which for a family man in the depths of the Great Depression, holding a steady government job, was no small threat to make. It came to a head one afternoon, when Friedman coolly waved the idea off one more time. Rowlett went home that evening, by his own memory, already composing his resignation and clearing out his desk in his mind. And the next morning, Friedman came into the office with his eyes shining, all lit up, and said, "We are going to do this." The idea Rowlett could not sell had gotten in under Friedman's skin and kept him up at night, and once he saw it, he saw all of it. The National Security Agency, telling this story decades later in its own classified history, gave that history a title that was really about the moment in Rowlett's head. It called it a beautiful idea. In 1935, the two men filed a rough patent on the design together, the schoolteacher and the geneticist, for the machine that would carry the most important secrets of the coming war and never give up one of them. There is a second irony sitting inside the first, and it belongs to Friedman. The same man who led the effort to build a machine the enemy could not read spent the hardest 18 months of his life leading the effort to break a machine the enemy thought no one could read. In 1939 and 1940, Friedman's tiny team took on the Japanese diplomatic cipher the Americans codenamed Purple, a machine the Japanese Foreign Ministry believed was completely secure. The Americans did not have a purple machine. They had never seen one. They had only the intercepted messages, streams of gibberish, and the conviction that somewhere underneath was a pattern a human mind could find. They found it by building the enemy's machine, the Japanese one, blind, out of theory and telephone relays, guessing at the wiring of a device none of them had ever laid eyes on. And in the end, assembling a working copy for the grand sum of $684.65 in parts. They had reconstructed a secret foreign cipher machine, correctly, from nothing but the noise it made, for the price of a used car. The break itself came on a Friday, the 20th of September, 1940, and it came through a young mathematician named Genevieve Grotjan. She was going over intercepts, hunting for a particular kind of hidden relationship between messages, the faint repeating link that would betray the machine underneath. And she saw it when no one else in the room had. The men around her remembered it for the rest of their lives. One of them was almost shouting. That's it, he said. Jean has found what we're looking for. Gro-chan, by the account of the people standing next to her, had tears in her eyes. It was one of the great intellectual feats of the war, and Friedman, characteristically, refused to let his own name be put at the front of it. No one person, he insisted afterward, could be singled out as deserving the major share of the credit. It had been done by a team, and he meant it. This was the kind of mind now standing behind the American machine. Friedman was the sort of cryptologist who worked by feel as much as by mathematics, and the stories about him had the quality of legend even while he was alive. Years before, in 1933, handed a cipher machine its makers advertised to the world as unbreakable, he had sat down with a message enciphered on it at 11:15 in the morning and, with no machines to help him and 50 minutes taken out for lunch, handed back the full solution by 2:45 that same afternoon. 2 hours and 41 minutes of actual work to take apart a device that was supposed to be beyond taking apart. He was a hard man to draw praise out of. Compliments from him were so rare that when he once scratched a single approving word onto a subordinate's report, the man put his head around the office door and asked him in what sounded like real concern whether he was feeling ill. That mind had beaten the finest cipher machine the Japanese possessed, which is exactly why what he and his people built for their own side was designed the way it was, to have none of the weaknesses they had just spent 18 months exploiting in someone else's. It cost Friedman something to do it. In the first days of 1941, not long after the triumph over purple, he collapsed. He was admitted in early January to the neuropsychiatric ward of Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, and he was not discharged for close to 2.5 months. An Army medical board, reviewing his case, described what had happened to him in careful clinical language. An anxiety reaction, marked by tension and insomnia, brought on by prolonged overwork on a top-secret project. The people around him understood it more simply, as the mind of a man who had spent 1.5 years staring into an enemy machine finally handing him the bill. There is no single document that draws a clean line from purple to that hospital bed, and it would be too neat to pretend there is. But the strain of the work is the explanation the people closest to him reached for, and it is not hard to believe. And here is the part that is almost too much. While Friedman lay in that ward, his own team was quietly packing up a copy of the purple machine he had helped break and carrying it across the Atlantic to hand to the British in exchange for what they knew about the Enigma. The man who had cracked the Japanese cipher was flat on his back in a hospital while the fruit of it was being traded to an ally. The war ran on without him for a while, on the strength of what he had already done. If the man who had the idea is barely remembered, there is a reason, and it is an ugly little story about credit. The Army was not the only service that wanted a machine like this. The Navy had its own code-breaking shop, and in 1935, when the Navy's people came around to the Army and got a look at what Rowlett had come up with, an officer there summed up their situation with painful honesty. The Navy, he said, had plenty of money for development, but they did not have any ideas. So they adopted the Army's. They saw the notion of rotors driving rotors, understood at once how good it was, and made it their own. For a few years it sat quietly, and then, in 1939, Rowlett got a lesson in how the world assigns credit. A Navy officer he was working with, a lieutenant commander, was sketching something out for him, walking him through the design of what he proudly called the Navy's new cipher machine. And as the drawing took shape on the paper in front of him, Rowlett felt what he later described as an increasingly sickening realization. He was looking at his own invention. The idea he had fought Friedman for a year to defend was being explained back to him as somebody else's work. He asked, as evenly as he could, whose idea it had been. The Navy man said he believed it had come from his own chief. Rowlett said nothing. There was nothing he could safely say. But it ate at him. He had watched the credit for the thing he had built walk across the room and attach itself to another man's name. In August of 1941, with the country only months from war and the two services facing the prospect of having to work in step with each other in a hurry, they did something without precedent. The Army and the Navy agreed to adopt a single, common cipher machine, the machine we now call the SIGABA, and they made a pact to guard it so tightly that they would not share it with anyone, not even the British allies whose own secret traffic it would soon be carrying. The two rival services, who agreed on almost nothing, agreed completely on this, and the last twist of the knife came long after the war, long after most of the men who built it were dead. When a patent was finally granted on the machine, many years later, the names on it as inventors were two Navy officers, Safford and Sealer. Not Friedman, not Rowlett. The man who had lain awake at night with the idea and fought his own boss to prove it was not on the patent for the machine his idea made possible. The proof of how well it all worked does not come from the American side, where you might expect it to be exaggerated. It comes from the enemy, in the enemy's own words, written down when they thought no one friendly would ever read them. Deep in the records of German signals intelligence, there is a running war diary, and in it you can watch the Germans meet this machine and give up on it in slow motion. In the spring of 1944, they note American traffic coming from a machine of an unknown type, something they cannot classify. They keep at it. And then, in an entry from September of 1944, with the war turning hard against them and every scrap of intelligence more precious than the last, comes the quiet surrender. The work on the American five-letter traffic, the diary records, has been discontinued as unprofitable at this time. Not cracked, not promising, not worth the effort anymore. They closed the file and moved on, and in doing so they wrote the machine's finest review without meaning to. You can hear the same thing from the men themselves. After the war, Allied teams went through the defeated German cryptologic service, interrogating its experts about what they had and had not managed to break. One senior German codebreaker walked his interrogators through the American systems he had beaten, the lower-grade ciphers, the field machines. About the SIGABA, he had nothing to report, because there was nothing. And in one of the neat cruelties of the whole business, this same man still believed his own Enigma had been unbreakable, at the very moment the Allies were reading it at will. Both sides were sure their machine was the perfect one. Only one of them was right, and it was not the side that ended up famous for it. That verdict has held up in a way the machine's own builders could never have tested. Long after the war, mathematicians went at the design again, this time with computers of a power Friedman's people could only have dreamed of. The honest result of that work was not that they had finally cracked it. It was that the thing was still, in any practical sense, out of reach, and that the whole exercise had served mainly as one more measurement of how strong the old machine had been all along. It was built to be unreadable by the hands of its own time, and it turned out to be unreadable by hands its makers never lived to see. Because the Americans believed in this machine, they guarded it like nothing else they owned. More than 10,000 SIGABAs were eventually built, and they swallowed rotors by the hundreds of thousands, close to 500,000 wheels, a great many of them wound by hand. Out in the field, a machine did not simply sit on a desk. An officer and an enlisted man, one of them carrying a weapon, would draw it from a secure store when it was needed, and the rotors were reset every single day. Even after the war was won, when someone dared to suggest that a 24-hour armed guard on every machine might now be excessive, the answer came straight back that the end of the fighting justified no relaxation at all, that no reason on earth existed to take the risk. The secret was to be kept exactly as hard in peace as it had been in war, and the Americans would not let the British have one. That refusal is worth sitting with, because of what this machine was carrying. The cables between Roosevelt and Churchill rode across the ocean on the SIGABA. So did the intelligence loop of the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat sightings and the decrypts passing between London, the code breakers in Washington, and back out over the water. The machine was handling the fruit of Britain's own greatest secret, the breaking of the Enigma. And still the United States would not hand its closest ally the device that carried it. They would share the intelligence. They would not share the machine. And if a SIGABA was ever in real danger of falling into the wrong hands, it was built to destroy itself rather than be read. A machine sent into a combat zone could be bolted to an 800-pound steel cabinet packed with something like 40 pounds of thermite, enough to reduce the guts of the machine to a puddle of molten metal in roughly 90 seconds. Where thermite was not enough, the manuals were blunt about the rest. "Destroy the index wheels," one of them reads, "by smashing them with a heavy hammer." This was a machine its owners would rather melt down or beat to pieces with a hammer than allow a single enemy to sit in front of one intact. Which brings us back to a truck in Colmar, and to the two occasions in the war when that fear very nearly came true. When the truck vanished from Colmar, no one in the American command could afford to assume the best. So, while French intelligence and American investigators were still combing the countryside for it, and long before anyone knew a pair of thermite charges was sitting harmlessly at the bottom of a river, the machine that ran the Western War was treated as compromised. The order that came down is the best measure of how seriously it was taken. On the strength of one stolen truck, the decision was made to change out the rotors on the entire SIGABA network. Not the machines in Colmar, not the machines in that division. All of them, across the whole theatre and beyond, every one of those more than 10,000 machines. New wheels pulled and fitted by the tens of thousands because no one could be sure how far the damage ran. And the only safe assumption was the worst one. An entire continent's worth of secret communication had its locks changed because a single truck was parked at a curb without a guard. And then the truth came out. And it is almost funny, in the way the most serious things sometimes are. There had been no German spy, no enemy raid, no brilliant intelligence coup. Two French farmers eventually came forward and pointed the investigators to a third man, a friend of theirs, a local. He had taken the truck for the most ordinary reason imaginable. He wanted to move some furniture. He had seen an unattended army vehicle, helped himself to it, and driven off, and he had no idea, then or ever, that the strong boxes in the back held anything more valuable than the truck itself. When he could not get them open, he got frightened and dumped the whole load in the river to be rid of it. The single worst security scare of the Western War was resolved not by a genius and not by a manhunt, but by the plain ignorance of a thief who never understood what he was holding. His name was never given up by the men who knew it, and it was never written down. He remains the most important nobody in the history of American cryptography. Colmar was the loud scare. There was a quieter one on the far side of the world that came even closer to the edge. In the early summer of 1944, at a forward American airbase deep in China at a place called Hengyang, an alarm went up that Japanese paratroopers were dropping to seize the field. It turned out to be false, but in the panic of the moment, with everyone certain the enemy was about to come over the wire, something was overlooked. As one account of that night records, in the scramble to save themselves and their equipment, no one thought of destroying the SIGABA machines. The machines that were never, under any circumstances, to be left intact for an enemy, were simply abandoned where they stood while men ran. One man did think of it, grabbed a set of the rotors and made for the river to get them away, and the small boat he was in capsized, and the man drowned, and the rotors went down with him into the current and were never recovered. They did not reach the enemy, which was the only thing that mattered. But there is a strange footnote even to this. The rotors that drowned with him are described in the record by a name that the codebreakers' own historians, to this day, cannot match to any machine they know. Even inside the archive, there is a piece of this story that no one has ever been able to read. And there is one more thing at the very edge of that same record, like a door left standing ajar. The source that tells the story of the drowned rotors mentions, almost in passing, that there was yet another SIGABA compromise scare. And then it simply stops. It does not say where or when or how it ended. Even here, inside the declassified history, written by the people whose job is to know, there is a piece of this left blank. The machine came through the entire war unbroken, and then its own side destroyed it. And the reason it was destroyed is the last turn of the paradox. It was not scrapped because it had grown old or weak. It was scrapped because it was still too good. When the shooting stopped, a colder standoff was already taking shape between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the design principle at the heart of the SIGABA, the trick of rotors governing rotors, was exactly the kind of advantage a country does not hand to a rival. Most of the machines were deliberately destroyed to keep the design from getting out. The technology, in the words of one internal history, was taken out of service specifically to keep it out of Soviet hands. The thing that made it worth building, that it was a generation ahead of anything else, was now the reason it could not be allowed to survive. A weapon too good to lose in wartime had become a secret too good to keep in peacetime, and the answer, both times, was the same. Get it out of reach. The patent tells the rest of it better than any summary could. The application filed in December of 1944 was judged too sensitive to publish, and so it sat, sealed year after year through the whole of the Cold War and out the other side. It was not granted until the 16th of January, 2001. 66 years after Frank Rowlett first had the idea in a room full of torn paper tape. 32 years after William Friedman was buried in Arlington, in 1969, having never lived to see the machine his life's work made possible acknowledged in public at all. The invention outlived the men who made it by a generation, and stayed secret for most of that time, because the surest sign of how well it had worked was that no one was ever allowed to talk about it. So, set the two machines side by side one last time. The Enigma is a household name. There are films about it and museums and a steady stream of books, and the reason for all of it, when you strip it down, is that the Enigma was defeated. Its story is the story of the people who beat it, the rooms they worked in, the war they helped turn. The breaking is the story. The American machine has no such story, and now you can see why. It was never beaten. There was no dramatic race because the enemy gave up in a diary entry. There was no disaster to survive because no plan was ever betrayed through it. No convoy lost, no landing blown, no man killed because the other side had read a SIGABA message, for the plain and total reason that the other side never read one. The greatest cryptographic triumph of the Second World War produced no story at all, because its entire achievement was to make certain that nothing happened. And nothing, however hard men worked for it, is a very difficult thing to remember. Go back at the end to the truck in the river. The most secure machine of the war was very nearly lost, and it was saved in the end by the one thing no security plan can engineer. The man who took it did not understand what he had. He was not an agent, not a genius, not an enemy. He was a farmer who wanted to move some furniture, and when he could not open the boxes, he threw them in the water. And by not knowing what he held, he kept it out of the only hands that could have used it. That is the whole life of this machine, told in a single image. It could sit, complete and perfect, in a stranger's grasp and remain unread because the people holding it never grasped what it was. The world had its hands on the most advanced cryptographic device on Earth, more than once, and did not know it. It slipped into a river, and it slipped out of memory for exactly the same reason. A thing that cannot be read cannot be told. The men who built it are almost as lost as the machine. Friedman died in 1969, 3 decades before the patent that proved his people right was finally unsealed. Frank Rowlett, the schoolteacher who could not sleep for a good idea and fought his own boss to defend it, waited longer than anyone for his share of the credit. Genevieve Grotjan, who found the thread that unraveled purple on a Friday afternoon in 1940, is a name almost no one knows. When the country did finally get around to thanking them, it did it in the same order it always had. It rewarded Friedman first, and the Navy's Cipher after him. Frank Rowlett, the man who had the whole idea in the first place, was made to wait years longer than either. There were never any names on the machine. That was the point of it. Almost nothing in this account comes from a textbook. It comes from a war diary the enemy kept and then lost. From cables General Marshall sent to General Eisenhower about a stolen truck, from an oral history an old codebreaker recorded decades later, from a patent that stayed sealed for 66 years, and from a safe that had to be raised out of a French river before anyone could read what was inside it. If you had family who served in the Signal Intelligence Service, or in the Navy's OP-20G, or anywhere in the Signal Corps, someone who wound those rotors by hand, or carried a machine from its store with a weapon on their shoulder, or simply kept a secret for 50 years and never told you what it was, we would count it a privilege to know their name. Leave it below. The machine was built to be forgotten. The people who made it work do not have to be.